3.3 Arousal, Stress and Anxiety. What is arousal? Arousal is said to be the intensity of behavior which refers to the degree of emotional energy that is felt in different situations. When the body is put under stress, arousal increases, which causes us to behave differently in order to get our arousal to an optimum level. There are two types of arousal, somatic and cognitive. Somatic arousal is linked to the changes in the body, such as sweating, adrenaline, and rises in blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing rate. Cognitive arousal relates to the changes within the mind, such as worrying, negative, positive thoughts, and excitement. Cognitive arousal can negatively affect sporting performance, as it can cause you to worry before a game, which can cause you to become less focused on playing well, as you will be thinking about making mistakes. This will affect the team as well, as it means that you won't be cooperating with the team because the cognitive arousal will cause you to be less engaged, which will cause you to miss the relative cues. However, in some cases, arousal can positively affect performance, as it can increase athletes' motivation and awareness due to the release of the hormone adrenaline. This will mean that athletes will have a higher drive to succeed, so much more effort will be put into performance. The drive theory. Drive theory shows the relationship between arousal and performance, and it states that an increase in arousal is directly proportional to an increase in the quality of performance. This is shown when Julio Cesar taunted Zlatan Ibrahimovic before a penalty, as it caused him to become stressed, which led to higher arousal. He then scored the penalty, as the higher level of arousal had caused his performance to improve. However, the quality of performance depends on how well the skill has been learned. For example, we got a novice and an autonomous learner to do keep-ups with the football whilst they were being cheered on. The novice struggled with the high levels of arousal, but the autonomous learner was able to do a lot better, which shows that the quality of the performance depends on how well the skill has been learned. A dominant response is the motor program that is already learned and will usually become evident when arousal is raised. This explains why a high-level athlete will benefit from higher arousal, as their dominant response will be a lot more advanced, as they have learnt the skills better than a novice has. Therefore, when arousal is raised, a novice is more likely to make mistakes, as their ability to perform the skill isn't as good as an elite athlete. This shows that high levels of arousal benefit an elite athlete a lot more, as the dominant response will allow them to perform skills fluently without mistake. A novice needs to work in an environment with low level of arousal so they can focus on the skills being learned. A criticism of this theory is that it doesn't explain why elite athletes fail with high arousals, like John Terry when he missed a penalty in the Champions League final. He has learned the technique to take a penalty and has the motor program to reproduce the skill, but he still missed, which shows that too much arousal can cause a decrease in the quality of performance. The inverted U theory. Unlike the drive theory, the inverted U theory identifies if an athlete becomes overly aroused, then it can cause the quality of performance to decrease. This can explain why the English national football team have a reputation for losing penalty shootouts, as their arousal levels become too high, which causes their performance to decrease, so they miss their shots. The inverted U theory has 3 points of arousal. Low arousal is when there is a lack of concentration, which prevents accurate decision making. Low arousal can be caused by things like playing at a low level, playing in a position you don't like, or because of a loss of interest in the sport. Optimum arousal is what is known as the perfect state, as it means that you have high concentration and are able to absorb important information, which leads to accurate decision making. High arousal leads to lack of concentration and is the state of near panic, which causes hypervigilance. High arousal can be due to things like anxiety, noise from the crowd, or the importance of the game, such as a cup final. Elite athletes should reach optimum arousal in every game in order to play as well as they can, as being under or overly aroused will lead to poor performances. An example of optimum arousal could be when Anthony Joshua beat Vladimir Klitschko in a boxing match, as he was able to remain extremely focused and absorb the important information. This allowed him to pick the perfect time to punch Klitschko and avoid being hit in order to win the fight. A criticism of this theory is that it is unlikely to have a smooth decline in performance as arousal increases, as there is normally a sharp drop. For example, Nigel de Jong became highly aroused in the 2010 World Cup and kicked Xabi Alonso in the chest while going in for a challenge. This shows that his performance didn't gradually decrease as he was not playing normally until he became too aroused, which caused him to lash out at the other player. The catastrophe theory. The catastrophe theory is a development on the inverted U theory, as it shows that the athletes are likely to have a sharp drop in performance called the catastrophe, rather than a slow decline when a player becomes too aroused. It shows that if somatic and cognitive arousal become too high, then it can cause your performance to drop dramatically, but there will be a steady increase to reach optimum arousal. The catastrophe can be caused by things like the situation, the importance of the event or game, and also if arousal is increased by only a small amount, it can cause athletes to have a decrease in performance. It is possible to control arousal after a catastrophe has happened, and you can then make a recovery to reach optimum arousal again. In the 2016 Olympics, Mo Farah fell over in the 10,000-meter race, which would be the catastrophe, but he was then able to control his arousal and carry on, which led to him winning the gold medal. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a negative experience of stress and is caused by worry or apprehension due to a fear of failure. Like arousal, you can get both somatic and cognitive anxiety. Cognitive anxiety would be things like worrying, apprehension, and fear of being judged, as they are mental symptoms of anxiety. Somatic anxiety is triggered by cognitive anxiety and could cause symptoms like sweating and an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, and breathing rate. Cognitive anxiety will normally happen hours or even days before the game or event, as many people get nervous about sports events beforehand. The somatic anxiety usually happens just before the event, as there will be a high arousal due to people and the environment. This will cause increases in heart rate and other body states that I mentioned previously. Anxiety can be somatic and cognitive, but there's also trait and state anxiety. Mike Walden states that state anxiety is the athlete's emotional state at any given time, variable from situation to situation, and trait anxiety is an athlete's disposition to interpreting a situation as threatening and responding with an increase in state anxiety. High trait anxiety means that a person will be more likely to experience anxiety in a situation. As it is a trait, it means it is part of your personality, which means that the amount of anxiety you experience in any given situation will remain quite stable, as personalities are hard to change. For example, if an athlete with high trait anxiety had to take a free throw in a friendly, then they would still be nervous even though the game isn't very important. This is because it is their natural response to become anxious when they are put under pressure, as they feel scared to let their team and coach down. However, if the athlete had state anxiety, then they would be less likely to become anxious before taking a free throw in a friendly, but if it was a cup final, then this would cause them to become very nervous. This is because the game is much more important, so they feel like they are under a lot more pressure, which causes their anxiety levels to rise. Impact of anxiety on performance. Anxiety is similar to arousal because if you experience both cognitive and somatic anxiety, it will cause a catastrophe, which means that there will be a dramatic decrease in the quality of performance. State anxiety can have negative effects on performance, as it can lead to mistakes being made in crucial parts of the game or event. For example, John Terry experienced state anxiety when he took a penalty in a Champions League final, which is a very important game, so he had a lot of pressure on him. John Terry isn't usually anxious, as he was the captain, so he had to be quite confident and not show fear, which shows that he doesn't have trait anxiety. However, the state anxiety caused him to become overly aroused, which caused him to miss the penalty, and he wasn't focused enough on his technique. Samantha James states that anxiety can cause weakness of muscles, which explains why people experience jelly legs before games and events. This will have a negative effect on performance, especially sports that involve explosive muscle contractions, such as 100-meter running and long jump, as it means that the muscles won't contract with as much force. This will mean that the performance won't be as good as it could have been if they were composed and didn't feel anxious. If someone has high trait anxiety, then this will cause a lot of problems with their performance, as they will experience anxiety a lot more frequently than other players. This will cause their performance to suffer, as they will feel lethargic and unmotivated, so they won't be able to put their maximum amount of effort into the game. Anxiety management. Deep breathing is one way to control anxiety, as it gives you time to regain composure and focus on one specific technique. It also allows you to decrease heart rate and get more oxygen to the muscles, so you can become more energetic. Deep breathing would normally be used before the game or event in order to control somatic anxiety, as it helps to reduce heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure. It can also be used just before a penalty, conversion, or free throw, as it gives you just enough time to regain composure before taking the shot. The limitation of deep breathing is that it can't be done when the game has not stopped, as it will cause you to pause for too long, which makes it easier for the opponents. Positive self-talk is another anxiety management technique, as it helps you to remove any negative thoughts caused by cognitive anxiety. Positive self-talk will also be done just before the game, as it will help you become motivated, or it could be done a few hours before when you experience cognitive anxiety. This is because it will help to remove any negative thoughts. Mental imagery helps you to visualize yourself doing something successfully in order to help you focus on a specific outcome of a skill or event. For example, a rugby player may visualize himself scoring conversions so that when he takes the shot he will be thinking positively and will be more focused on the correct technique needed. Another anxiety management method is to practice regularly in order to improve techniques, as it will mean that you will be less anxious about performing the skill in a live performance. This is because you will have developed your understanding of the technique and will be able to reproduce it in games, so you won't worry about it as much. For example, a football player may be anxious when taking penalties in a game, as they may fear missing the shot, but if they practice then they will be more confident when taking a penalty, as they will have the better technique. The limitation of practice is that it takes time to learn a certain technique, so it can't be done just before or during a game or event. Focusing on your skills also helps to reduce anxiety, as it distracts your mind from thinking negatively and also means it is less likely that you will make mistakes. This helps to control cognitive anxiety and also means that you won't feel anxious about performing a certain skill, as your mind will be more focused on the correct technique needed, so there is more chance that you will be successful. Paying attention to relevant cues is a good way of controlling anxiety, as it means that you will make less mistakes, so you will feel more confident. This will mean that anxiety levels will decrease and performance will then start to improve, as you will be more engaged in the game. This technique will be used during the game because that is when it is important to focus on the relevant cues so that you don't make silly mistakes like not marking a player. Biofeedback is when you electronically monitor a bodily function such as breathing so that you can train the person to control it. This can be done by any athlete and would be done weeks before a performance, as it gives the athlete time to train themselves so they can control their bodily function. However, the limitation is that the machine needed is very expensive and you need a qualified person to operate it and train you. What is stress? Lazarus and Folkman, 1984, state that stress is a pattern of negative psychological states and psychological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being, which they may be unable to meet. This means that people will become extremely nervous or anxious when a situation occurs where the person feels like they won't succeed, or if they think the situation could cause some kind of harm to them. A stressor is what causes a person to become anxious, stressed, and aroused. There are two types of stress: eustress and distress. Eustress is a good form of stress that gives you a feeling of fulfillment, and many athletes seek this as it gives them a challenge. The advantages of eustress is that it can increase skill level and improve intrinsic motivation. An example of eustress could be when Alex Honnold climbed El Capitan without a harness. This is because it caused a lot of stress, but not the kind that would demotivate you, as he stayed extremely focused and had a great feeling of achievement after he had completed it. Distress is a negative form of stress that occurs due to a perceived inability to meet demands. This causes a strong form of worry and apprehension, so if an athlete experiences this, then it will negatively impact their performance. An example of distress in sport could be when John Terry missed his penalty in the Champions League final, as he experienced a negative form of stress which made him overly aroused, so his performance decreased. The stress curve graph. The stress curve is very similar to the inverted U theory. It shows that when stress reaches an optimum point, your performance will be at the best of your ability. If stress levels are too low, then it will mean that the athlete will be laid back and won't be putting in a lot of effort, so performance will not be very good. If stress levels become too high, then this can cause anxiety, panic, and anger, which will lead to a decrease in performance where the athlete will burn out. Stresses. There are a lot of things that can cause someone to become stressed, which have been put into 5 main groups: internal, external, personal, occupational, and sports environment. One internal factor could be when someone is overly critical, which means that they might think that something they have done or what they look like isn't good enough. For example, a person might think that they look really fat even though they have an average BMI for their age and gender. This causes them to become stressed, as they think that other people will view them in the same way as they view themselves. Cognitive anxiety can also cause stress, as it causes you to think negatively, which means that you start to worry about things a lot more. This happens a lot to a lot of sports players. They will get cognitive anxiety before important events or games, which will lead to them becoming stressed, as they are overthinking and worry about making mistakes. A lack of sleep can cause someone to become stressed, because if they have important things to do the next day, such as tests, presentations, or a sporting event, then they will want to have as much energy as possible. However, if they have a lack of sleep, then they will become stressed, as they will worry about not doing their best in whatever they have to do in the day.